Sure. My name's Robbie Cooper. I'm 51. I'm based in Brighton. And I used to be a photojournalist many years ago. So I, was doing stories for magazines, and back when, there were budgets and everything, and I ended up kind of specializing on work about digital culture, I suppose. And, I was a video game player, and I was interested in virtual worlds, and I ended up doing a book on virtual worlds, and then I did work on kind of people's interactions with screens. And as I got kind of more interested in, I suppose in the process of doing stuff about games and exploring that world, I also started to sort of incorporate it more and more into the way that I work. So kind of initially, I was just doing stuff like taking screen grabs of people's avatars. So I would go into the game world and pose them or whatever. And that got me thinking about the virtual camera and the virtual world. And I think at that time, video game engines weren't quite as accessible as they are now. But I think the Source engine from Valve was out. But I never really got into that. But over the years, I have kind of got into using video game technology, in my work. So I started off kind of doing stuff where I thought that I would just kind of employ people who would kind of execute my ideas, and that turns out to be a very bad way of working. And so kind of the first thing I did was I did like a Stanford Uni online course on programming, which to my amazement I absolutely love. And then I started doing sculpture. I'm just about to start a course on rigging. So as time goes on, I kind of, I've got more and more into the technical side. So when I think about ideas now and how to execute them, I guess the ways that I can go, the landscape has completely changed from that point of view, in that I can execute things in a lot of different ways. And in fact, kind of like at the moment, for example, I'm about to start doing a series, and it's really the first sort of completely personal project that I've done for a long time. I've done a lot of sort of marketing campaigns and ad campaigns and stuff like that, but with this one, I'm just gonna the end result is going to be partly painted, as in paint on canvas, but there will be other layers to it, and it's going to incorporate a lot of the stuff that I've been exploring. So yeah, I guess I've gone from sort of just commenting or trying to comment on video games and video game culture to exploring the way that they're done and incorporating that into my work.
Well, I know, you've done series on, people's reactions to things that they interact with through screens or that they watch through screens. Not just games, but like, comedy, sports, religion, pornography. I mean, in a greater sense, like, what is it that you're sort of interested in there, and like on a deeper level, like what do you think you're exploring that the people you're documenting aren't even aware of that like is being explored?
I suppose that particular project is quite intensely voyeuristic, and and it's about kind of being a voyeur and kind of I sort of being in a having a point of view that you shouldn't really have, like, so in that series, you're kind of looking straight into people's eye, and you're not really supposed to kind of be in that position. It's like kind of well, one thing that when I've had the idea, one thing it made me think of was kind of like, if you get stoned and you're watching TV and you're feeling paranoid, can the TV see me? It's a bit like that. And I suppose that the sort of the area that it was exploring was just kind of, the culture of watching stuff and being watched and sort of, ideas about privacy breaking down and really kind of at the time that I was doing it, I suppose it was just at the point when it was becoming obvious how far the internet was changing everything. Because there had been quite a long period before then when, there was the internet arrived, and then everyone was a bit like kind of, oh, is that it, sort of thing, and there was the .com bubble, and that burst, and then sort of, so it's almost like I think people had kind of accepted it and forgotten about it, and then suddenly just realised how far things had gone. And it was really at that moment that I did that project. So I suppose, you're not supposed to feel completely comfortable looking at it. I mean, you mentioned pornography, and I think, a huge numbers of us use the internet for that. And that was like a particularly interesting area because you don't think about intimacy when you're using the internet for pornography. I mean, and in fact, there's nothing intimate about it. So kind of, in that series, what I was doing was taking out all the sexual content so that all you're left with is the intimacy, and it's sort of brutally intimate and quite difficult to watch as a consequence. So yeah, I was just sort of looking at things like that, really.
Well, I mean, do you feel like, you mentioned video game culture, which is a phrase that always interests me because I think it's a little bit of a nesting doll because there's just many smaller subcultures within them. Do you feel like do all parts sort of reflect the whole, like, or are there things like when you explore or think about video games, like, can it tell you something about us that looks elsewhere in life or looks elsewhere at online life can't?
Sorry, say that again. So what do you talking about? Larger themes than just the internet and video games. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there are aspects of it that resonate with. I suppose like the you know, I hesitate to sort of talk, you know, about that kind of thing because you just start to sound incredibly pretentious. But like,
I was similarly hesitant in asking it for that reason. Yeah.
But you know, for example, like with the stuff where people are looking at stuff. I mean, I suppose there is just something about life, you know, about just going through life, kind of, and or powerlessness maybe, and I think kind of with alter ego, with the kind of, you know, people and their avatars, and there's, you know, the search for identity, and I suppose playing with identity. So, you know, these things definitely have resonance, you know, in a kind of, in a larger context. I mean, I think things always do, though. You know, I mean, like you can look at anything and it has implications for you know, in a wider context. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I wish there was a sort of a less cheesy way of asking this, but maybe you just touched on it. But you know, what did you learn doing alter ego? I mean, maybe it's stuff that you didn't even click in your head until years later. But I mean, looking back on it now, like, what do you think you took with you from doing it?
I think that I suppose like I just met an enormous range of people, and there was kind of a staggering scale to what I saw, you know, and the experience of doing alter ego led to me doing immersion because, you know, as I was doing alter ego, I kind of went to places like South Korea and China, and those places absolutely blew my mind. And I kind of, you know, I sort of saw things happening on a scale that I hadn't really thought about. And, you know, the internet cafes, the size, all, you know, rows and rows of people playing games, and this was, you know, before phones came, all kind of smart, so you did of people on the street just sort of engrossed in their screens wasn't, you know, it wasn't something that you normally came across. So that was something that really, that was quite a powerful experience. I mean, and I remember someone I was traveling with, you know, in China, kind of being also really powerfully affected by just the scale of it. Just, I suppose it's part of it is the country, but then just seeing multitudes of people kind of living that life, as it were, like an online life. I mean, that was not something that I had really been exposed to. You know, just sort of sat in internet cafes smoking cigarettes, and, you know, for hours and hours and hours and hours. So there, but then there was just there was lots of other things as well about kind of just people playing with ideas, people playing, and just the huge variety of different ways that people interact with the same sorts of content, and the different ways that people found to kind of, you know, say, make money out of it, or exploit different parts of it, or, you know, there was sort of that type of interaction where people were actually sort of finding little niches and loopholes and kind of in the digital world to make money. And then there were the people who were just completely happy to use it as recreation, and sort of let their imaginations roam and have fun with it. So it was so that it would be, but knowing kind of in the abstract that it's going to be very varied is very different from really going out there and meeting people, one after the other for months on end. I mean, that was pretty mind blowing.
I mean, do you feel like there's a nuance that you learned about people? I mean, it's such a weird way to categorize people, I think, because we do hear words like video game culture as if it's some sort of like tent that everybody is in. But I mean, I guess I'm curious, like, do you run into the opposite? Like are there still ways you sense people have a disconnect with video games, or a lack of willingness to understand or just engage, what they are on a superficial level?
Do you mean people who aren't into video games?
Yes.
People who don't play video games?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a big motivation for doing Alter Ego in the first place, was that just particularly in the press, the attitude to video games and people who play video games was extremely patronising and stupid.
Yeah.
And I, when I had exhibitions, I kind of experienced that. Like, I remember being interviewed by someone, for example, for a sort of, TV news item in the UK, and she was treating me like, the interviewer was treating me like I was stupid. Like, what she wanted was me to just sort of provide an answer that made it that she wanted. So she was trying to design questions that were shoehorning me into sort of like saying a specific thing, and then when I didn't, she kind of treated me as if I was being socially and would repeat the same thing over and over again, like hoping to sort of break my will. And eventually I'd just give her the answer that she wanted, and then she could go home, And it's just like, and I suppose that's just bad journalism, but I mean, there was a lot of that at that time. It was just, and since then, I think things have changed quite a lot. And I think there was a period of time when, maybe 10 years ago or something like that, when suddenly that video games are probably the dominant medium now, and they've had a huge influence on all sorts of different art forms, and a huge influence on culture generally, and people aren't quite as snobby as they used to be, and probably a lot of people who were sort of secret video game lovers have become less shy about admitting that they're into video games, and it's sort of come out of the closet a little bit, but you still come across it. People still,
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was thinking the other day. I remember. It was easily over 10 years ago. Pitching magazines like just a random name that comes to mind, Joseph Gordon-Levitt. It's like, oh, we should do an interview with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, because I think I saw him on some late night show, sort of offhandedly mentioning that he loves video games and magazine was cool. Yeah, let's see if we can get him. And then his publicist was just sort of in sort of steadfast denial that no, he doesn't play games, and he wouldn't want to have a conversation about that. I think you do see less of that, as if it was some sort of like it's these weird stigmas, I guess, that are holdovers from the 80s or something, where it's like not just a guilty pleasure that someone might play a video game, but like you see it in TV as a trope often, like when you used to see like Dr. House or something playing a Game Boy or whatever, that it was supposed to mean like, oh, there's something sinister or wrong with this person. Look at them. They even play video games.
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I think I can hear you a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you miss all that?
Should we try signing off and rebooting the call, see if that helps?
Yeah, we can do that. Sure. Hello?
Hiya.
Hey there. Yeah, I don't know what all you heard of that. I was just talking about my experience pitching an interview to a magazine.
Yeah.
And the publicist just sort of being in denial that the star who had talked on TV about playing games, that they even played games. Like, in other words, like to say that they played games meant that there was something wrong with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when was this? How long ago was that?
Oh gosh, I feel like I could even check my email inbox. It easily would have been. It would have been in the last 10 years. I could tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think things have changed, but I think there are still people who are quite patronising about it. I mean, like I had an ex-girlfriend sort of commented on the fact that I play video games at the age of 50 or whatever, and I was like, yeah, I do every now and then, but I also, I use video game engines in my work, and my work is about video games. It would be pretty weird if I didn't. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I guess like, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because like if you were a film geek, if you were Quentin Tarantino, well, if I was Quentin Tarantino, then nobody would give a shit. But I mean, like, but if you were a film geek, then maybe it wouldn't be, it wouldn't sort of be something that someone would comment on. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but then I do think like maybe not as much lately, but so much has been going on lately. But I feel like there's sort of a perennial headline about avatars, or even like lots of modern thinkers like Yuval Harari, for example, are sort of fixed on this idea of there's a generation of young dudes right now who can't do anything spectacularly well except play video games. I don't know if you've seen that. I don't know if you have an opinion about that. I don't know if you make anything of it. Have you seen those kind of headlines I'm talking about? Hello? Hello?
Hey, yeah. I've got an idea.
Oh, yeah?
I have a feeling that this might be because basically my line is being upgraded to like a sort of fast fiber optic line, and they delivered the router today, and I know that it would have finished switching to the new thing on Monday, and I'm just wondering if these problems have got something to do with that. But should we reschedule for like next week, by which time hopefully this will be sorted?
We can, if you think that would be easier and it's not a hassle on your end.
I mean, we could keep going, and then but it's happened twice now. If it happens again, let's just reschedule for next week. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm always I don't know. I can never tell whose end these types of problems are. I just know that like since quarantine and everything, these types of things seem to happen all the time, and I just feel like based on odds, it can't always be on my end.
No, they're definitely. They're almost certainly not on your end.
It's whatever you have. It's whatever you have the patience for. Obviously, we lose a bit of momentum every time. I'm fine to keep pressing on and see if maybe we can just get it in this go. And if not, we can definitely just like try for next week.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if you heard my previous question, but I think you were talking about sometimes being criticized for playing games, even though you use game engines in your work, and I was just sort of connecting with this sort of perennial headline about avatars and about games, and like I see like a lot of modern thinkers like Yuval Harari, for example, sort of fixed on this idea of like, there's this generation now of young dudes, and usually these pieces specifically talk about young men, that they can't do anything really well other than like play video games with almost like cyborg level of skills. So I don't know if you've seen those headlines and pieces. I don't know if you make anything of them. Has anything like that crossed your radar?
I haven't heard about Harari. I kind of I like his stuff. I haven't heard him talk about that particular thing, but I know the general thrust of what you're talking about. Yeah. And is it a sort of a fear about a whole generation that has grown up doing kind of stuff online, and they're worried about them not having kind of real world skills? Is that what you're talking about?
That tends to be the flavor of these things. Yeah.
I mean, I think my personal view is that maybe there is some degree of truth in but these things are always sweeping generalizations, aren't they? And there's, when you get down to sort of granular detail, it's always much more complex and interesting than that. And I think that in a lot of cases, a kid that gets into playing video games at one stage is not going to just become pathologically addicted to that for the rest of their life. I mean, I've been addicted to things, and the story of your life, unless you're extremely unlucky and unfortunate, you're not just defeated by things like that necessarily. They're things that you have to overcome, and you have to develop new skills, and you have to sort of challenge yourself to grow in areas where you're perhaps underdeveloped, and I think kind of I just sort of looking around me. I don't have kids myself, but kind of people my age who have kids, the variation between kids and in their sort of from 15 to sort of 21, in how they are and their relationship to, say, games or online life, and how they were brought up. It's really interesting. I mean, my ex-wife, for example, who I'm friends with, has kids and made a decision to only allow them to play games during the holidays. So during term time, during school, they weren't allowed any of it at all, nothing. Mm-hmm. And now they kind of, they can take it or leave it. So I think kind of, there's definite benefits for sort of forced abstinence during, a kid's upbringing. But yeah, I mean that isn't always possible, is it? So, yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit wary of sort of huge sweeping generalizations which take in entire generations of people and saying, this is the problem.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, and even, I've read those pieces, and in just talking about them out loud, hearing the sounds come out of my mouth, it's like, oh, well, this just feels like the next variation on the old moral panics about games. And I mean, I don't know, maybe we've already beaten it to death at this point, but I guess I'm curious to hear, like, if this is a semi-popular way of thinking. Like, I guess I'm just wondering myself, like, well, where do the questions go inevitably? What are the implications of that inevitably? Or is it more a matter of, like, there need to be more thinkers on a similar volume and frequency, sort of, spreading a more nuanced truth?
In relation to video games specifically?
Yeah, and just sort of it yielding this sort of crop of young men who can't do anything else in life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, what was your question?
I think I was just sort of wondering myself that, like, either is this a case where do there need to be more figures speaking something more nuanced on a similar platform, or is it? I guess I'm also just half wondering, like, if this is a popular way of thinking, like, well, what are the questions and implications from there inevitably?
But is this not a problem with sort of discourse in general? I mean,
yeah.
At the moment, even I think quite reputable news sources have a problem getting noticed and getting traction. And the thing that seems to work is opinion that drives engagement, and the opinion that drives engagement is divisive and negative a lot of the time. And you have it in political discourse, and I mean that is sort of one of the really unfortunate effects of the internet, and probably why we need regulation of companies like Facebook and stuff like that. I trust government to sort of create that sort of regulation more than I trust, the people who are in charge of Facebook. I don't think Facebook or companies like that should have more influence over society than governments do. That's completely topsy-turvy, and hopefully it's not. Hopefully this is just a phase in history, and in 10 years we'll look back and they will have they'll be regulated, and it won't be possible for people to sort of stoke opinions in quite the way that they do at the moment. I mean, it's really toxic. I mean, what you're talking about it in relation to video games, and that's actually quite a benign case now. I mean, in terms of the sorts of debates and inverted commas that are generated online now, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's got completely out of control. And you have like a polarization of opinion. And, like you were saying, we do need more nuanced and intelligent debate. And at the moment, we're really not. We really don't have that. Maybe you can sort of create little, I don't know, amongst your friends or whatever on Facebook or something like that, or wherever you can find ways of sort of moderating things so that you don't have. But I mean, in this country, for example, when Brexit happened, it really kicked off online, and people were really getting personal and slagging each other off, and things that were about Brexit and that sort of political situation would degenerate really quickly into quite toxic slaying matches, and I think it's a problem, isn't it? I mean, I don't really.
Well, I find there's a problem too and I think we're talking about like echo chambers online and the way, our digital lives, maybe this is kind of a telling way that this is often the frame that we think of life in terms of our digital and offline lives, like we're sort of defined by our proximity to the internet. But something I've really tracked and have tried to make sense of is like, so you mentioned Brexit, and you mentioned that, I think correctly too, that like this in terms of toxicity online, that in games it's sort of benign in the scope of everything happening in 2020. But there's been this sort of like persisting, blunt narrative that I feel like I mainly see in game circles. I sometimes see on some tech and culture outposts that sort of they write or talk as though video games are sort of the patient zero of everything wrong in our culture or world today. That somehow like video games invented misogyny, somehow Gamergate is responsible for Trump being president. I'm sure these are things you've possibly heard, maybe not, but I am curious, like what do you make of that, and like why is that such an enduring frame that people seem to latch onto and still say all these years later?
I suppose it's because, but they must latch on to loads of other things as well, right? I mean, in my immediate environment, I know quite a few people who are into conspiracy theories, and kind of what you were talking about there definitely strayed into the land of conspiracy theories. And what amazes me about that is that it's all around us. I mean, I know people who have really outlandish ideas about how things happen, and some of them, may have sort of personality disorders and stuff like that. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I don't really know. But and the sort of the sort of totems or the emblems of that people sort of fixate on aren't very original. It's kind of it might be video games, people who play video games, but it might equally be privileged, people who are privileged, people who, people aren't very imaginative in how they construct kind of bogeymen. They're just received, I mean, and video games have been have been a sort of a target of it for very many years. I mean, sort of in my lifetime, I think the sort of the height of it was the hot coffee sort of thing. I mean, that was pretty big, wasn't it? I mean, that was the whole, a case, and there was, it kind of got quite political, and I mean, and I think things like that are bound to happen. If you think about how big it is as an industry, and how many people do it, and it is, there are aspects of it which are extremely toxic. I mean, I think there are aspects of most cultural, forces which are toxic. I mean, like if you were sort of into rock and roll, it's sort of undeniable that the rock and roll lifestyle has very sort of toxic aspects to it, and the same is true of video games, I think. I mean, if you look at esports, for example, it's a very weird kind of preoccupation, isn't it? And a very weird occupation. I mean, I think there are sort of people in that world who really do it well and who make shitloads of money.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole swathe of people who are victims of it, essentially. And it is just a marketing exercise for video games. And that lifestyle of being an esports player, it's toxic to humans. I mean, you can't play video games for, all day. Or most people, I'm sure there are people who can, but most people can't play video games for that much time without having some kind of, without having some sort of, impact on their psyche, and there's very little support given to those people by the video games industry. I mean, they're just milking it. So it would be sort of immature to say that the video game industry is a sort of like little lamb that's just completely innocent and draws the fire of these mean people, because there's a lot going on that's really fucked up. But I think the most interesting thing about what you said is about the paucity of debate. Basically, I mean, it's really an environment now where people shout at each other and nobody listens. There's an interesting thing by Jordan Peterson talking about, postmodernist thinking and how kind of there are certain postmodernist thinkers who think that, there's no me and there's no you, and I'm just the sort of nexus of all the social forces that made me, and so are you, and so it's just my power talking to your power. So there's really no reason for me to listen to you. I just got to shut you up. And and there's sort of that feels like a very sort of now thought. It's almost like people don't have the patience anymore, and people want simple solutions because everything's so incredibly complex that hardly anyone knows what the hell's going on.
As I've been hearing.
you know what I mean? Nobody really knows what's going on. So, like, if you have like a simple sounding kind of insight into, you know, what went wrong or what the solution is, then I mean that's got to be why someone like some absolute insane maniac like Trump can get in, is he just like fixed on one particular, you know, avenue of sort of hatred and anger and rode it, you know, as hard as he could.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it always feels a bit absurd, or it does for me, to always sort of like follow these lines and then look for ways where it's like, okay, well, you know, to sort of say this, but about video games. And I mean, I've heard people, I don't know, it depends how far the rabbit hole do you want to get.
Go on.
I've heard, I mean, I don't know. This is very much at the heart of like what I'm in the process of wrapping up a book about. But I can just say a couple things I've heard is, and I think you're right. It does sort of just veer over into conspiracy theories, because who really knows? But there's sort of this notion out there that the reason that sort of video game culture as an entity doesn't push back on getting wrapped up in these sorts of conspiracy theories is because there's this feeling of like being lent a form of mainstream legitimacy through it, or in other words, like, hey, we're on the big stage, we're on the big platform. It doesn't matter what people are saying about us, people are talking about us. I think you see less of that lately. Just it's been interesting to see like how COVID has impacted these types of conspiracies. But I think that feeling is out there. And I also know, like, when you talk about toxicity, I've talked to a lot of people at game companies, and they feel toxicity, if it's a problem that can be solved, that's up to Facebook and Google to solve. In other words, like, it's not up to them to tend their own gardens. So that's just two sort of deep in the rabbit hole things that I've heard. Not really a question in there, but that's some of what my head is swimming around in lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity for video game companies. But the trouble is the video game companies are just solely focused on shifting units.
Right.
And so doing something, I mean, I suppose esports is a marketing exercise. The whole thing is a marketing exercise. But that, you know, but it seems like there could be an avenue to be better than Facebook, or to do things that are kind of leading the charge, and therefore steer the conversation in a way. I mean, you know, take control of it a little bit, and therefore be taken a little bit more seriously in certain respects. I mean, you know, you don't have to try too hard to be taken more seriously than Trump, or you know, Zuckerberg is just becoming sort of obscene, isn't he? He's just an absolute wanker. And I think in that sort of landscape, you could really do a lot to you know, steer the conversation in a different direction. But you know, like you said, I don't think they're focused on that. But you know, which is a shame. I mean, I think. I mean, in terms of the conspiracy that you talked about kind of what they're sort of they're being taken seriously on some level, so the hatred they don't mind or something. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a strong note of it. Yeah.
I, 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 don't, I don't really know why that. 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 I kind of, it doesn't really mean anything either way. Do you know what I mean? It's
I do. It's easy to read into the lack of something, but it doesn't really tell you much because there's still a lack of something.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose a lot of people in video games have tried to create culture that is not just about shifting units, but and this is why video games aren't art. It's entertainment, and the job of an entertainment company is to get as many people entertained by their products as possible. And all those other avenues of sort of kind of smaller projects, more interesting things, kind of that are looking at maybe more difficult subjects or whatever. I mean, I think there was a period of time a few years ago when people were focused on that kind of thing, but it feels like that moment has passed. I mean, now people are talking about esports and also kind of, I guess, the sort of persistent world idea has come back again. I guess second life, but kind of a new type of second life. I guess it's kind of the metaverse or whatever. Epic Games. I know they want to make that, don't they?
Yeah, I'm glad you. I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to ask about it. Although I know it's a bit of an old canard at this point. Just the whole question of our game's art, and although it's funny because it's not as dusty as I think people think. I did 2 interviews last Friday, so less than a week ago, and in the morning somebody referenced it, and then in the afternoon someone much younger referenced it, and couldn't quite remember Roger Ebert's name. He said, I think some film critic named Roger something said it. So I mean, I hate to ask, but you mentioned in our emails, seeing video games as an art form misunderstands how the art world works, and you said that art isn't high culture, it's just interior decor for the 1%. Now, I've always sort of been skeptical of this frame because I think it doesn't understand that the art world itself can't even agree on what art is. But I wonder why do you think this has been so sticky for decades and decades? What is it that people are really arguing about if they don't understand the art world?
I think it's a sort of potential way to make games be taken more seriously in a cultural sense, isn't it? So by stressing the enormous creative energy and creative genius that goes into making games, you're sort of, I guess, making a case for its credibility, but I was just saying that doesn't necessarily mean that the art world needs to take it seriously, because it's not being positioned as art. It's entertainment, and I know that the art world disagrees, sort of internally about what is art and what isn't, but as a community they really have a demarcation line around them, and they have kind of sort of quite clear boundaries, and there's a lot of creative genius in Francis Ford Coppola's movies, say, but that doesn't mean it's art, or is even looking to be art. I don't know. I've never spoken to Francis Ford Coppola, obviously, but I mean, it's just Um, but there are people who make games and who want those games to be perceived in that way. So I think it is possible. There's no reason why you can't use. You can make art with anything, but it's also far too corporate, isn't it? I mean, we were just talking about why doesn't the video game industry do anything to sort of clean up its own house? And the reason for that is that they're solely interested in shifting units. And that's also the reason why they're not going to be taken very seriously in the art world.
Yeah.
So, even though Grand Theft Auto, say, for example, is genius and, is multi-layered and probably had an absolutely, massive impact, culturally in comparison to pretty much any artist or artwork, you still can't say that it's art. It's just there are boundaries around these things, and so they're categorized. And that is when I was saying that it's just interior decor for the super rich. I was just being a little bit kind of facetious about it, because it's not that big a deal. There's not that much meaning in the boundaries between these things. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that was something I was going to ask, is like, what, because I think it's a bit of that's a frame, I guess, that goes back to the 90s, and so I wonder 30 years later, what in 2020 even is high culture, does it even really still exist in the age of, well, in the age of the internet, but also in the age of COVID,
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. And I bet you it's something that the art world is struggling with. I read a piece on ArtNet, I think it was yesterday, actually, about how, the art world has to start taking digital and interactive much more seriously, because museums and galleries are, under threat, just like pretty much every sector of the art world. And the obvious solution to that is interactivity and online stuff and digital stuff. And so COVID might actually really start to change the landscape.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is changing the landscape, but it might change the landscape in that respect. But still, even then, it's going to be, it's going to be Damien Hirst, doing it, not Rockstar Games.
Well, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about just like the corporate context that a lot of the biggest games come from, and how that sort of plants them more in the entertainment world. But I mean, even if there's not that thick of a membrane between whatever high culture is and isn't, like what do you think are the problems of high culture that games just aren't equipped to handle, or don't seem interested in even acknowledging?
Wow, I mean, for example, just trying to engage people in critical thinking, or to leave room for the viewer to see something that was perhaps unintended, or kind of all these sort of slightly subtler things that, and I know, video games nowadays are incredible entertainment vehicles, and they have, a lot of a lot of tools in their tool set, and a lot of techniques, and a lot of ways of approaching stories. But you don't necessarily want to, for example, create an experience that's completely coherent. You don't, if you were doing a painting, for example, you might leave things open a lot more to a viewer's own experience. Whereas I think in video games, even so visually, things are constructed in such a way as to tell a story, for example, in order to, create very specific experiences at specific points in the narrative. And I think they even analyze that on a, statistical level to see that as many people as possible are getting the intended experience out of that design. That's not really, I don't think that's really the way artworks are constructed.
Yeah, I would agree. I was just thinking back on just like the people I've crossed paths with who work on those sort of games or who write those kind of games, and how often the sort of unspoken, maybe sometimes explicitly spoken direction is how you almost have to treat players like they're stupid, or like how they might be confused or don't understand what they're supposed to be doing, or that they have to constantly be directed. That is true. There's very little, I think there's less and less feeling of things that are open to interpretation and things that are just there that you're not even sure if they're just there to be open to interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, the whole landscape, will be designed to be seen from a certain angle, because the player is going to be coming out in a known area, maybe not precise on a certain spot, but they know the general area.
Yeah.
And so that you might have kind of, say, a point of interest to the left that is the first thing that the eye is supposed to see, and then gets drawn in that direction, and it comes back to that thing of one of the age-old criticisms of video games, which probably is from the 90s, of are you pushing the buttons or is it pushing your buttons? But I personally find all of that unbelievable, energy and research into that sort of level of design. I find it fascinating, and now I can see it when I'm reacting to it. Which is kind of interesting to have that sort of detachment or whatever. But yeah, I think it's a fruitless exercise to sort of want those big juggernauts to be taken seriously as art. They have been in pretty major art institutions in exhibitions. I mean, I think the Smithsonian and MoMA and various people have put big video games into exhibitions.
Yeah.
But I think also that was kind of a specific moment in time, wasn't it? It was kind of at that moment when everybody said, like, okay, so this is the dominant medium now.
Yeah, I mean, this will sound gossipy, but just from talking to, well, pardon the pun, but many of the players involved with that, this isn't necessarily true of those specific institutions, but sometimes the push to include games in museums is a way to sort of combat flagging uh, uh, um, audience numbers. Sorry, I was totally blanking on the term. And like I've talked to people who make smaller games who have had their work sort of exhibited in those things, and they say like I don't think this is necessarily the point of museums, but they've talked about like having their work exhibited in those walls doesn't really translate into much. Like they don't see people reach out. They don't see an uptick of like sales or anything like that. But I think some of that too is like on the part of museums, like trying to understand how to best contextualize like games in museums in a way that's not just it looks like there's an arcade suddenly,
Yeah.
Well, so to abstract out, I mean, as you said about, are you pushing its buttons or vice versa? And because so much, because we talked about sort of looking through screens and living through screens, like what do you think is sort of unexamined about the way we live with the internet and sort of how we treat each other on it or through it? Like what are ways where you think we're confusing who's pressing what buttons and why?
Sorry, say that again, mate.
Sure. Well, you had mentioned about games, that comment about, are you pressing its buttons or vice versa? And I was just curious to abstract out, like, what do you think is similarly unexamined about the internet and the way we treat each other on it, i.e., like, the times we're pressing buttons on it and it's pressing buttons on us?
I mean, I think these things are pretty well studied, aren't they? I mean, they're so of the moment, and they're so hugely important, and we're kind of at a critical moment, I think, and we seem to be failing like on all levels, and so people are casting around trying to find answers, and I think the internet and internet use and data and all these things are being studied and written about, and so they should be. I'm not really particularly aware of any area that is really not being covered. I think there are some really great books out there if you're interested in this stuff, and some great research into it. It's not that the information isn't out there. It's just I guess taking action. It's the next step, isn't it?
Yeah.
And people kind of disagreeing over the best way forward, and so yeah, I don't particularly think it's kind of a lack of investigation or a lack of research. I think it's more, the echo chamber thing, which is just it's really ridiculous at this point, and I really hope that we are at a moment where it's just kind of at its peak. I just don't think that we're in a situation where it's acceptable that people can post absolute fiction and lies that people know is fiction and lies as if it's true, and that is not, and that's okay. It's such a potentially catastrophic situation right now that I think that the time for that we've got to have laws and regulation, and I hope that comes soon.
Well, I have just one or two more here for you. I guess these are more about blame. Like, what are you sort of tired of seeing the internet blamed for? And I guess it's like a two-parter. Like, what are you tired of seeing video games blamed for?
I think a lot, a lot of the narratives that what got very tiresome seem to have thankfully disappeared a bit. I think violence in video games is a little bit of a I think for a while people were really overly interested in the fact that in a video game you're kind of doing something, even if you're just tapping buttons or whatever. You're in inverted commas, shooting a gun or what have you, and there was a time when school shooters and that sort of connection was made between somebody who wants to go walk around their school, blowing people away and then killing themselves, and the fact that they may have done it in a video game beforehand or whatever, and that's another area where there's a lot of interesting research being done, and it's basically it's it's an extremely narcissistic way of committing suicide. And it doesn't, it's probably got a lot more to do with celebrity culture than it does with video games. It's a desire to be famous.
Right.
I'm gonna kill myself, and I'm gonna take all these people out at the same time so that nobody ever forgets my name. And it doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with video games, really. And that caused an awful lot of, a lot of ink was wasted on that stuff. And I think the answers would have been around for a long time, and people know it. And so it's a kind of a tired conversation.
Yeah.
But like I said, I haven't heard that recently. Have you heard that stuff recently? I don't know, but.
I guess it depends how you define recently, but no, it doesn't drift into my memory as something that is that recent. I mean, my whole sense of linear time has been pretty skewed by quarantine and everything.
So there's that, and the internet was. I mean, have you ever seen that 1999 interview with David Bowie where he's talking about the internet?
No, please tell me.
Oh, it's amazing. No, he was just saying that, and this was back in 1999, and he was saying that we hadn't seen anything yet, and the effects of the internet are going to be like aliens landing, and I really don't underestimate the effects that the internet has had, and I can't think of any criticism of the internet which is completely unjust. Can you think of any which, off the top of your head, which are completely sort of seem to you to be?
No, I mean, I mean, yeah.
A lot of the stuff is just obvious. I mean, with kids, for example, we already touched on the subject of kids. You shouldn't really let kids, be on the. And I know that it's not an option for a lot of people, but it's not going to have a great effect. I mean, and I think up till 2, they just shouldn't be anywhere near it. And then kind of I don't, yeah, nowhere near screens. And I can't think off the top of my head. I can't think of any criticism of the internet which is completely unfounded.
Well, let's see if we can go maybe more profound from there. This will be my last question for you. What do you feel video games have accomplished?
Fucking hell, that's a good question, mate. On a cultural level, what have they accomplished? Is that your question?
No, it's just what have they accomplished? I mean, I think really what I'm interested in is just sort of whatever the knee-jerk gut reaction is. It's sort of intentionally open to interpretation, not to be coy, but just because I guess I'm curious what do people think that question is about, and what does it mean to them?
I mean, I think for me, it's a whole new way of telling stories. It's a whole new way of interacting with people, whilst kind of, being in stories. I think the thing that set my imagination on fire, when I did Alter Ego, was I was talking to this guy who was divorced from his kids. This was, probably 18 years ago or something like that. And he was playing EverQuest and interacting with his kids in the game. And they would talk about homework and school and kind of stuff that had happened during the day. And that completely blew my mind because, that, I suppose, having a context of pure fantasy and a game where you're interacting with your kids and you're talking about very real things, and there's a very real emotional need for that stuff. That was the first time I'd ever heard of something like that, and I guess that now is quite normal. But that's an amazing thing to be able to play with other people who aren't in the same space. And share that, that fantasy and that entertaining world, and that, be transported, into these sort of other experiences, whilst having the ability to sort of maintain real emotional connection at the same time. I think that's, I suppose it's a technological extension of things that already existed, but it's very, that happened in my lifetime. The ability to sort of to play a game and to have that connection, and then you see. I guess there's, for me, increasingly as well, there's this other side to it of how they're executed and the whole construction of these spaces. And that, to me, is fascinating. And that's almost kind of like an engineering accomplishment, sort of like building, palaces and cathedrals and all the things that people used to build in the real world. But we were talking earlier on about how constructed the visuals are to, and how closely that relates to telling the story. I mean, that there's an amazing relationship there between sort of architecture, narrative, spatial design, the sorts of visual design that you have in pure 2D visuals, and sort of bringing that all together into something that works as a whole. That's extraordinary. I mean, one of the incredible things about video games and video games companies is the organization that takes. And I suppose that's why, they are just focused on shifting copies, because they've got to pay for all of that. You've got to cost $200 million or whatever to make that game. But there is something quite extraordinary and breathtaking about that level of cooperation between people and massive talent on many different levels, from programming to art and narrative storytelling. So I think they're really marvelous things, and I think they're kind of underappreciated from that point of view. I don't know why that is particularly. Maybe it's because they exist on TV screens and people are used to whatever coming out of the TV and computer screens, whatever. So, but yeah. So I think that sort of that's an enormous accomplishment, and I think that has driven loads of other things. The sort of, I suppose, and I think this is something that is going to continue to grow. But, for example, NASA going to the moon or kind of the space industry has loads of offshoots and loads of other effects on other industries. And I think the video game industry has had a similar effect on other industries, and that's really starting to ramp up now, and I think that will increase as time goes on. And we've just touched on COVID and how that's changing the landscape. I think that the influence of video games on the rest of how things are done in the rest of everything from sort of architecture to also the auto industry and cars and design and all that stuff. I think it's going to continue to have an effect. Also, the medical industry, the way people perform operations and interact with doctors and all these sorts of things. I think that game technology is starting to find its way into lots of other areas. So yeah, I think it's pretty extraordinary.